Evening, folks. Come sit by this fire a spell, for I got a tale tonight about something the world's near about forgot how to do. Trust a man on nothing but his word. Lord have mercy, nowadays a fella won't lend you a cup of sugar unless you sign a paper for it. But I recall a time, not so long past in the telling of it, when a man's word was worth more than any gold coin in his pocket. My grandpappy Elias taught me that lesson, and he taught it to me hard, the way the best lessons always come. I was a boy of maybe 10 or 11, and our farm had hit a rough patch. A sickness had took 2 of our mules that spring, right during planting season, and without 'em, we couldn't break the ground proper, nor haul what needed hauling. Elias was beside himself with worry, for a farm that don't plant on time don't harvest come fall, and a farm that don't harvest come winter. Now there was a man some miles off, named of Jonah Whitfield, who had more mules than he rightly needed that season. Elias didn't have 2 corns to rub together after losing them animals and paying the vet what little he could, but he saddled up what horse we had left and rode over to Whitfield's place anyhow. I rode along, perched behind him, curious what a man does when he's got need but no means. We come up on Whitfield's barn, and Elias dismounted slow, hat in hand, and asked plain, could he borrow a mule for the planting, promised to return it come fall with something extra for the trouble soon as the harvest sold. Now Whitfield didn't know us well. We weren't kin, weren't even close neighbors, just 2 farmers who'd shook hands a handful of times at the county gatherings. There weren't no paper drawn up, no signature, no promise writ down nowhere, just Elias's word and the look in his eye when he give it. Whitfield studied him a long moment, and I recall holding my breath, for I half expected the man to turn us away. But then Whitfield nodded slow and said, Elias, I've watched you work your land for 10 years now. I've seen you pay every debt you ever owed, even the ones you could have talked your way out of. Take the mule, bring it back when your harvest comes in, and not a day sooner if you need it longer. That was it, folks. No paper, no interest charged, no collateral held, just one man's word matched against another man's memory of how that word had held up over years of watching. We led that mule home, and I asked Elias, walking alongside, Grandpappy, how'd you know he'd say yes? Elias was quiet a moment, then said something I carried with me my whole life after. I didn't know for certain, Silas, but I know this. A man's word is the only thing he truly owns that can't be took from him unless he gives it away himself. I've spent my whole life making sure mine was worth something, so that the day come I needed to lean on it, it'd hold my weight. We worked that mule hard but fair through planting season, fed it well, treated it kind as our own, and come harvest, when the harvest sold, Elias rode back to Whitfield's with the mule, a sack of cornmeal as thanks, and something more, a debt of trust repaid in full, with interest, paid not in corn, but in character. I didn't understand the whole weight of it then, being just a boy, but I understood enough to know that what passed between them 2 men that day on the road was worth more than any bank could hold. Elias didn't have gold to offer. He had something rarer, a name that meant something, built up patient over years, spent careful like a man spends his last dollar, knowing he might need it again someday. That was the first time I learnt it, folks, even before I rightly understood the whole of what I learned. Stay with me now, for there's more to this story than a borrowed mule. There's a piece of it that come from watching my own son Tommy learn a harder lesson about trust, and a piece that come from Eleanor on a night when our own word was put to the test in a way I never expected. Come sundown, I'll tell you the rest.
Now let me tell you about a winter when my boy Tommy learned trust ain't always returned the way it's given, and how that lesson near broke his young heart before it made him stronger for it. Tommy was about 14 that year. old enough to be doing a man's work and thinking a man's thoughts, but young enough still to believe the whole world worked the way Elias had taught me it oughta. There was a fella come through our parts that autumn, named Cyrus Beale, selling himself as a trading man, moving goods between towns. Smooth talker, that one, with a way of making a body feel like he'd known you his whole life inside of 10 minutes. Beale come to our farm needing to borrow against some goods he had coming. Said he was short on funds to pay a debt elsewhere, and if we'd lend him what coin we could spare, he'd repay double once his shipment come through, on top of leaving us a fine-looking pocket watch as surety till then. I was wary, folks, I'll admit it plain. Something about the man's eyes didn't sit right with me, the way they moved too quick, never resting long on a body's face. But Tommy, eager to prove himself a man of business, same as his pa and great-grandpappy before him, pleaded with me to let him handle it himself, said he wanted to learn what it meant to extend trust, same as Elias had with Whitfield. Against my better judgment, I let him. Tommy took what little savings he'd put aside from selling eggs and odd jobs, handed it over to Bill, and took that pocket watch in exchange, proud as a peacock, certain he'd done right by the lesson his great-grandpappy had taught him. Well, folks, I reckon you can guess what come of it. Bill never come back. Not that week, not that month, not ever again in these parts. And when Tommy finally took that pocket watch to a jeweler in town, hoping to at least recoup something if the man truly never returned, he learned it weren't worth but a fraction of what he'd handed over. Cheap metal dressed up to look like silver. I never seen a boy so crestfallen as Tommy was that evening, setting on the porch step, staring at that worthless watch in his palm like it might turn honest if he looked at it hard enough. "Pa," he said, voice thick, "I thought trust was supposed to come back. Great-grandpappy said—" "I know what he said, son," I told him, sitting down beside him. "But your great-grandpappy also said something else, something I maybe didn't pass on clear enough. Trust ain't a sure thing you hand out and get back guaranteed, same as planting the seed don't guarantee a harvest if the soil's bad or the rain don't come. What your great-grandpappy trusted in Whitfield weren't a stranger's smooth talk. It was 10 years of watching a man's character prove itself, season after season." Tommy looked at me, confused and hurting. And how am I supposed to know who to trust? I thought on that a long while before answering, for it weren't a simple question, and I didn't want to give him a simple false answer. You watch, son. You watch how a man treats them who can't do nothing for him in return. You watch if his word from last month matches his word this month. A smooth tongue can fool you once, maybe twice, but character don't fool nobody who's willing to watch close and wait patient before handing over what's precious to him. It was a hard lesson and an expensive one for a boy his age, but I'll tell you what come of it that surprised me. Tommy didn't grow bitter, didn't stop trusting folks in tie, which I half feared he might. Instead, he grew careful, watchful in a way that served him well the rest of his life. He learned to give trust slow, in small measures first, watching how it was handled before handing over something larger. Years later, when Tommy had a farm and family of his own, he told me once that the money he'd lost to Bill was the cheapest education he'd ever bought, for it taught him the difference between Elias's kind of trust, earned slow and tested by years, and the false kind, dressed up quick in fine words and borrowed shine, same as that worthless watch. But there's more to this story yet, folks. Come sundown, I'll tell you about a night when Eleanor and I had to decide whether to trust a stranger ourselves with something far more precious than coin or watches, and what come of putting faith in a man we never laid eyes on before that very night.
This here's a tale about the night Eleanor and I learned trust ain't just something you extend careful and slow, like Tommy come to understand. Sometimes, folks, trust gets forced on you sudden, in the space of a single decision, with no years of watching a man's character to lean on, only your own gut.
and the kind of faith that comes from somewhere deeper than reason. It was deep autumn, a few years past Tommy's troubles with that crooked trader. A storm had rolled in hard off the mountains, rain coming down in sheets, when there come a pounding at our cabin door near midnight. Eleanor and I both startled awake, and I'll admit my first thought weren't a charitable one. A knock at midnight in a storm don't usually bring good tidings. I opened that door cautious, lantern raised, and there stood a stranger, soaked clean through, holding a bundle wrapped tight against the rain. A young man, maybe 20 years on this earth, eyes wild with something between fear and desperation. "Please," he said, voice shaking from cold or fear or both, "my wife's birthing my first child, and something's gone wrong. The midwife in town's 3 hours' ride in good weather, and this storm's washed out the low bridge. I need to leave my horse here, take yours if you got one fresher and surer-footed in this mud, and I need—" He stopped, looking down at the bundle in his arms, which I then realized weren't no bundle of cloth at all, but a small leather satchel. He said, "I need you to hold this for me." He held it out. "It's everything we owned, every coin we saved these 3 years, meant for a piece of land we was fixing to buy come spring. If something happens to me on that ride, if I don't come back," his voice broke, "I can't risk losing it in a river crossing, and there ain't time to explain more. Please, I never laid eyes on you before tonight, and I got no right to ask this, but I got nowhere else to turn." Now, folks, here was a stranger, name unknown to us, handing over the whole of his family's worldly savings on faith alone in the middle of a stormy night to two people he'd never see again if his gamble went wrong. I looked to Eleanor, and she looked to me, and there weren't no time for the kind of careful watching Tommy had learned to practice. "Take my horse," I told him. "She's fresher and surer-footed in the mud than yours, and don't you worry on that satchel. It'll be here, every coin of it, whether you're back by morning or whether it takes you a week." He thanked us, voice cracking, and was gone into the storm 'fore I'd hardly finished speaking. Eleanor took that satchel inside, set it on our cable, and we both stood there a moment, staring at a stranger's entire future resting between us. "Silas," Eleanor said, quiet, "we don't even know that man's name." "No, we don't," I agreed. "And if he doesn't come back?" I thought on that a long moment. "Then I reckon we go searching for whoever he left behind, and we make sure this satchel finds its way to her and that child, even if it takes us asking every soul within 50 miles. We didn't sleep much that night, folks, tending the fire, watching the storm rage on, that satchel setting there on our table like a held breath. Near dawn, the rain finally let up, and not an hour after, we heard horse hooves approaching fast. It was him, soaked and exhausted, but smiling wide enough to light the whole morning. "A boy," he said, before I'd even got the door full open, "strong and healthy, and my wife's resting easy. The midwife made it in time thanks to your horse cutting that ride near in half." He took that satchel back with hands that shook from relief more than cold, and tried to press coin into my palm for the trouble, which I refused outright. "You didn't borrow nothing that needed paying back, son. You just needed two folks willing to believe a desperate man weren't lying in the middle of the worst night of his life." He rode off after resting a spell, and Eleanor and I never did learn his name proper, nor see him again, though we heard tell years later of a farm some 20 miles off, prospering fine, run by a man with a grown son who'd been born during a terrible storm the same autumn I'm speaking of. Eleanor said something to me that morning I never forgot. Silas, your grandpappy trusted a neighbor of 10 years. Tommy trusted a stranger with smooth words and false promise. But us, we trusted a man on nothing but the truth in his eyes and the fear in his voice. I reckon that's its own kind of trust, different from the others, but no less real. There's one more piece to this story yet, folks, a piece that ties together everything Elias, Tommy, and that storm-soaked stranger taught us on a night much later when I had to decide what kind of man I wanted to be remembered as. Come sundown, I'll tell you that final piece.
Now I want to tell you about something that happened years on from that stormy night. Something that showed me how the trust a man gives out into the world has a way of finding its way back to him, even when he ain't looking for it nor expecting it. I was an older man by then. Tommy grown with a family of his own, farm running steady, life settled into the comfortable rhythm of a man past his hardest years. It was deep into a difficult winter. Crops had been poor that year on account of a dry summer, and money was tighter than it'd been in some time. Tighter even in that spring when Elias had borrowed Whitfield's mule all them years before. A man come to our farm one bitter cold morning, a man I didn't recognize at first, weathered and grown into middle age, but something familiar in his bearing. He introduced himself as Caleb Marsh, and the moment he said his name, I placed him. He was the young father from that storm-soaked night, grown 20 years older, the boy born that evening likely a young man himself by now. "Mr. Silas," he said, "I've thought on you and your wife many a year, and I heard through folks traveling through these parts that your harvest come up short this season. I've done well for myself since that night, built up a good business in town, and I never forgot what you and Eleanor did for me and my family when we had nothing to offer you back but a stranger's word." He'd brought with him supplies, grain, salted meat, enough to see us comfortable through the rest of that hard winter, and he refused to hear a single word of payment or return. "You didn't lend me money that night," he said, echoing near the exact words I told him all them years before. "You lent me faith when I had nothing else to offer but desperation. I couldn't repay that with coin then, and I won't insult what you did by trying to repay it with coin now. But I can make sure two old folks who showed a stranger kindness don't go hungry come spring." Eleanor wept some at that, and I'll admit my own eyes weren't dry neither, for it weren't the supplies themselves that moved me so, but the understanding that something planted careless years before, a single act of faith in a desperate stranger, had grown roots deep enough to come back and steady us in our own time of need. I thought then on Elias and Whitfield's mule, on Tommy and that false trader's worthless watch, on Eleanor and me handing over a stranger's life savings on nothing but the truth in his frightened eyes. And I understood something that tied all three together, something I hadn't fully grasped till that moment, watching Caleb unload provisions from his wagon into our barn. Trust ain't a single transaction, folks, like a coin passed hand to hand and forgotten. It's more like a seed planted in soil you can't always see the bottom of. Sometimes it takes root quick, like Whitfield's faith in Elias, built on years of watching and proving. Sometimes it gets planted in poor ground, like Thomas' trust in a man who never deserved it, and you learn from the failed harvest what soil to avoid next time. And sometimes, folks, you plant a seed in a single desperate night, not knowing if it'll ever grow at all, and 20 years later, a grown man shows up at your door with a wagon full of grain, proving that even faith-given blind in the middle of a storm can bear fruit you never thought to expect. "Caleb," I asked him, helping him unload them last few sacks, "whatever become of that boy born that night?" He smiled, wide and proud. "Grown into a fine young man, Mr. Silas. Got his wife of his own now, expecting their first child come summer. I've told him the story of that night more times than he'd like to care to hear it again, about the strangers who trusted his desperate father with everything they had to offer, asking nothing in return but his word he'd come back. I stood there in that cold barn, watching a debt none of us had ever expected to be repaid come back threefold, and I thought how strange and how wonderful it was that the trust Elias had taught me on a dusty road with Whitfield's mule had traveled through me, through a storm, through 20 years, and landed back on my own doorstep in my time of greatest need. There's one final piece to this story, folks. The lesson I come to understand only after watching all these threads weave together over a lifetime. Come sundown, I'll tell you that last piece, and what I believe truly made trust worth more than gold back in them days when a man's word was the only currency that never lost its value. I want to tell you now, folks, what I come to understand only after watching all these threads of my life weave together. Elias and Whitfield's mule, Tommy and that false-hearted traitor, Eleanor and the storm-soaked stranger, and Caleb's wagon of grain arriving 20 years on. It weren't no single grand realization that struck me sudden, but something that settled into my bones slow, the way truth often does for a man who lives long enough to watch it prove itself over and again. I was sitting on my porch one evening, well into my older years by then, Eleanor beside me, same as always, and I got to thinking on why trust held such value back in them days, more than it seems to hold now in a world that's grown so quick to demand paper and signature for every small promise made between two souls. Gold, folks, has a peculiar property to it. It don't care who holds it. A coin earned honest spends the same as a coin stolen or cheated out of some poor fool. Gold don't know the character of the hand it passes through, don't remember kindness nor punish cruelty. It's just metal, shiny and useful, but blind as a stone to the nature of the man carrying it. Trust, though, trust remembers. Trust carries a man's whole history within it. Every promise kept or broken, every kindness shown or withheld. When Whitfield handed Elias that mule on nothing but a handshake, he weren't just lending an animal. He was placing a wager on 10 years of watching a neighbor's character prove itself reliable season after season. That mule cost him nothing more than the metal of a few coins might have, but the trust behind the lending was built from something gold could never buy: time, observation, and a reputation earned slow and careful. And when Tommy lost his savings to that smooth-talking traitor, he learned something equally valuable, though it cost him dear to learn it. That false trust given too quick, without the patient watching Elias had practiced, weren't really trust at all. It was hope dressed up and fooled by appearance, same as that watch had been cheap metal dressed up to look like silver. True trust, I come to understand, always requires time to prove itself, whether that time is 10 years like Elias gave Elias, or comes compressed into the desperate truth of a single stormy night, same as Eleanor and I extended to a stranger we'd never see clear in daylight. That's the part that struck me most sitting on that porch, that trust give freely to a desperate stranger with no years of watching behind it can still be true trust, so long as it's answering something real. Eleanor and I didn't know Caleb's character from 10 years of observation. We knew it from the rawness of his fear, the truth that don't lie easy in a man's eyes when he's begging for his wife and child's life. That kind of trust is rarer and braver than the kind built slow, for it asks a man to read truth in a single desperate moment, rather than confirm it across a decade of small dealings. Eleanor, I said that evening on the porch, I believe I finally understand why gold can buy you most anything in this world, but it can't buy you 1 ounce of trust.
She looked at me, that same patient smile she always had when she was waiting for me to arrive somewhere she'd long since settled herself. And why's that, Silas? 'Cause trust ain't a thing you purchase, it's a thing you earn through years like Elias did with Whitfield, or you extend on faith alone like we did with Caleb, knowing full well we might never see a return on it. But gold you can steal, counterfeit, win at cards, or inherit without doing a single thing to deserve it. Trust can't be faked for long, and it can't be forced from a man who ain't willing to give it. That's what makes it worth more in the end. A coin's value never changes whether the man holding it is honest or wicked. But trust only has value when it's true, and that truth has to be earned or answered one way or another. Eleanor took my hand then, the same way she had that stormy night, the same way she had during that other storm years before, when the crack of fallen timber had shook us both from sleep. Your grandpappy give trust slow and earned. Tommy learned trust given too fast can fail. We gave trust blind to a desperate truth, and Caleb returned trust threefold years after we'd nearly forgotten giving it at all. Seems to me, Silas, that's the whole lesson laid bare. There ain't only one way to trust rightly. There's just different soils, different seasons, and different kinds of faith, all worth more than gold when they're true. I sat with that a long while, watching the light fade over fields I'd worked my whole life, fields bought and kept and passed down through nothing more than years of honest dealing and a name that meant something to them who knew it. Stay with me, folks, for I got one final word to leave you with, the simplest truth of this whole story, and the part I fear the world's forgetting faster than near anything else I've spoken on these evenings past.